You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for July 8th, 2022. This week, fish oil, America's heart health, pharmacist and prescribing, and statins. While I was away on vacation, Circulation published an extremely provocative analysis from the 2018 REDUCE-IT trial of icosapent ethyl, which I will call IPE from now on, not Vasepa, because I'm allergic to using brand names. This was versus a mineral oil placebo in statin-treated patients with high triglycerides and high cardiovascular risk. Let me give you some background first, then we'll go to the Circulation paper, which, by the way, included many of the same authors as REDUCE-IT. Now recall that REDUCE-IT shocked the cardiology community. Get this, over nearly 5 years of follow-up, MACE events such as CV death, MI, stroke, unstable angina, or revascularization occurred in 17.2% of those in the IPE group compared with 22% of those in the mineral oil arm. On cardiology trials, this nearly 5% absolute risk reduction is considered a massive effect size. And in relative terms, the 25% relative risk reduction was highly statistically significant. These results stunned cardiologists for many reasons. First was the large effect size and statistical robustness. The second surprising feature was that these patients were already on statin drugs, a therapy known to reduce future risk of cardiac events. And finally, and most surprising, was that REDUCE-IT was such an outlier, right? No other fish oil trials had come close to such positive results. But, as it always is in medicine, closer inspection of the data muddied these top-line results. First, the high dose of fish oil led to only modest reductions in levels of triglycerides. And that's curious because reductions in triglycerides was felt to be one of the main ways that EPA confers its benefits. Now, experts countered these concerns by arguing, rightly I think, that fish oil may work through other means. Now, the more pressing concern with REDUCE-IT was the placebo or mineral oil arm. Patients in this arm sustained significant increases in levels of LDL cholesterol, ApoB, and high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and these are all markers of increased risk for cardiac events, which led to the existential question regarding REDUCE-IT. Did IPE reduce cardiac events because of its high dose and pure EPA content, or did the mineral oil placebo arm cause an increase in events? Okay, next background information, the STRENGTH trial. This debate only intensified 2 years later when JAMA published a STRENGTH trial of an EPA DHA supplement. Now, this was versus placebo in a similar high-risk statin-treated population. In fact, the STRENGTH trial was stopped due to futility. But did it fail because EPA and DHA combination doesn't work, or did it fail because their placebo group was corn oil, not mineral oil, and there were no increases in atherogenic properties with corn oil? All right, next background information, the EVAPORATE trial. About the same time as STRENGTH came out, a separate group of researchers set out to study plaque characteristics in patients like those enrolled in REDUCE-IT and treated with IPE or mineral oil, just like in REDUCE-IT. The European Heart Journal published the EVAPORATE trial, which concluded that IPE resulted in plaque regression compared with placebo. However, and this is a however times 10, EVAPORATE also reported a doubling of plaque volume in the mineral oil group. So there was the same problem as REDUCE-IT. Was IPE great or mineral oil terrible? All right, now to the new Circulation paper. This was led by Mr. Inflammation, Dr. Paul Ridker. The paper took advantage of the fact that patients in REDUCE-IT had stored blood samples that Ridker's lab could then analyze for important biomarkers and compounds that were on the inflammatory cascade. Things like interleukin-1, 6, high-sensitivity CRP, oxidase LDL, homocysteine, lipoprotein(a), and a bunch of others. These were available at baseline and then at 24 months in both groups. Get this, at baseline, there were no differences, as you'd expect. In the IPE group, there were no significant changes of these atherogenic properties over time, but the levels of biomarkers associated with atherosclerosis increased over time in those allocated to the mineral oil treatment, and all of these increases in all of these compounds were statistically significant. The conclusions were that IPE had minimal effects on the markers of atherogenesis, unlike mineral oil, and it led the authors, remember, some of these are similar to the REDUCE-IT authors, to say this, quote, "The effect of these findings on the interpretation of the overall risk reductions in clinical events observed within REDUCE-IT is uncertain," end quote. Now remember, there was hardly anything about REDUCE-IT when it came out that was uncertain. We heard about p-values that were the smallest p-values we'd ever heard about. So this is a big change. It's an extremely cautious conclusion, and I'd say we already knew that mineral oil increased LDL and high-sensitivity CRP. Now we know, thanks to the same authors, which is pretty cool, that mineral oil increases all kinds of atherogenic compounds. And in EVAPORATE, it may have led to a doubling of plaque burden. So my conclusions and comments, I side much closer to the Steve Nissen opinion that it isn't the EPA that drove the results of REDUCE-IT, it was the harm from the control arm. Now, proponents will counter with modeling studies that say the amount of increased harm from mineral oil only reduces the benefit from IPE. It does not eliminate all of it. Now, okay, if the pandemic teaches us one thing, it is the lack of precision from modeling studies. And this story may go down as the absolute best example of the importance of considering the control arm in trial interpretation. I would also suggest the possibility that practicing doctors sort of knew this, right? Uptake of IPE has been super weak, and this is despite a massive risk reduction in REDUCE-IT. One possibility is that pre-authorizations and cost and pill burden kept uptake of IPE low, but another is that docs sensed the nuances of the seminal trial. Finally, two more quick points. One is that this is a shining example of the importance of having two, not one, regulatory trials before approval. Millions, perhaps billions of dollars have been spent on IPE. And what if it doesn't reduce outcomes? Second, and I've said this before, we ought to have more open data. I mean, take the EVAPORATE trial. If there was actually a doubling of plaque in a matter of a year in the mineral oil group, these patients would be completely occluded and dead in short order. Major papers such as this should have to open their data and images for independent review. All right, next topic, heart health in the U.S. Circulation has published an AHA President's Update on Cardiovascular Health. Now, AHA used to include a checklist of 7 items called Life Simple 7. You know them: diet, exercise, smoking, BMI, blood lipids, blood glucose, and blood pressure. The checklist has now gone to Life's Essential 8. The new addition is sleep duration. So each of these they score using an algorithm from 0 to 100. And along with this new document in Circulation, AHA also published an observational study using NHANES data to assess the status of CV health in U.S. adults and children from 2013 to 2018, and the news was not good. And keep in mind, it truncated in 2018. So whatever bad news I'm going to tell you, it's fair to estimate that CV health worsened during the pandemic years, because about 9 out of every 10 patients I see in my clinic had cardiovascular health decline during the pandemic restrictions. For the study, led by AHA President Donald Lloyd Jones, they looked at about 23,000 participants that were part of the NHANES longitudinal database. These were ages 2 through 79. And for each participant, they calculated an overall cardiovascular health score, and it ranged from 0 to 100, as well as the score on each of the Life's Essential 8. 80% of adults scored at a low or moderate levels for cardiovascular health. Only 0.45%, less than 1% of adults had a perfect score of 100. 20% had high cardiovascular health, a score of 80 plus. Women had better cardiovascular health than men, and in general, adults scored lowest in the areas of diet, physical activity, and BMI. Children's diet scores were low at an average of 40.6. And get this, among children ages 2 through 19, only 2% had optimal CV health scores. And the proportion with high cardiovascular health declined markedly with older age. 56% of 2 to 5-year-old children had high cardiovascular health, compared with 33% of 6 to 11-year-olds and down to 14% for 12 to 19-year-olds. Again, I reiterate, as bad as these numbers are, I will bet you 2 espressos that U.S. cardiovascular health declined in more recent years, especially children who were kept out of school and school activities. Now, comments. Why is this important? Well, a month ago, on the June 10th, #TWIC podcast, I discussed a provocative study in JAMA Cardiology that found that expansion of Medicaid led to more healthcare consumption among low-income adults in those states, but no change in cardiovascular risk factor management. And I noted that this sort of data was not an outlier. 3 other major studies found the same. More access to healthcare led to more consumption of healthcare, but no or little differences in outcomes. And what I took from that is that heart health likely stems from matters upstream from clinicians. I said, quote, perhaps basic health outcomes, say not dying of heart disease or cancer or lung disease, has more to do with societal factors and things like a yearly exam or vascular or cancer screening. That is, if you live in a community where the norm is to smoke or not exercise or not go to learn a trade or go to get a college degree, it might be these factors that lead to higher rates of disease. And to me, this new AHA data bolsters that premise. I mean, take the children, who in this study had dismal scores of cardiovascular health. Children should be beacons of cardiovascular health. Yet the data show that as an American toddler progresses through childhood, their heart health declines. That's critical because atherosclerosis is a slow process, and the earlier it begins, the more likely it is to strike in middle age. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in 20 to 30 years with all this type 2 diabetes and obesity in American youth? And look, I love cardiology, and I know we do wonderful things, especially when we treat people who are asking for our help. But heart health in populations is not in our wheelhouse. Our specialty is fixing people with problems, which is a darn important thing to learn how to do well. Preventing heart disease means changing the norms of society and culture. Sure, clinicians can lead by example by, say, riding our bikes to work and staying lean. But it is to really influence American heart health is going to require changes in societal norms. And the irony is that the richer we become as a society, the more susceptible we seem to become to heart disease. And I don't have the answer as to how to fix this, but more cath labs and medical centers is not the answer. Okay, next topic, pharmacist prescribing. This week, FDA has decreed that pharmacists could prescribe the antiviral nirmatrelvir and ritonavir for appropriate patients. The FDA statement says that patients need to bring their medical records so that they have kidney and liver function available, and they need to bring a list of medications, as this antiviral has a ton of drug-drug interactions. And then pharmacists are supposed to refer patients to the doc if they don't know the labs or the patient's meds, or if there is a contraindication with another drug. And this could be significant because patients most likely to benefit from the antiviral are higher risk patients who, by virtue of the higher risk, may be on medicines that have interactions, the common anticoagulant apixaban, for instance. Now, here's why I highlight this issue on a cardiology podcast. I've seen and heard a fair amount of guff about this coming from American docs. And I'm sympathetic as to why FDA gets to decree such an order, almost by fiat. I want to remind listeners that just north of our border in Canada, pharmacists have prescribing privileges. So it may not be normal here, but it is in other places. And I've not heard about safety issues from my Canadian friends. The issue with this particular drug, the antiviral for COVID-19, is that it's best started soon after symptoms and a positive test. And here in the U.S., it's hard to get access to docs that fast. And international listeners may be perplexed to hear that. But unless you have a concierge doc whom you pay a retainer fee, or you are very lucky, most Americans struggle to see a non-emergency medicine doc urgently. Now, as listeners know, I am drawn to alternative care models because our current model clearly overspends and underdelivers. Now, for instance, I've embraced the notion that advanced practice clinicians can match the level of outcomes of physicians on average. And speaking of APCs, we not only allow, but most health systems embrace letting an APC, who may have a mere 2 years of training after a nursing degree, prescribe all manner of medicines. Our APCs in my practice prescribe many of the same drugs that I prescribe. Why then, if we let an APC, who may have a mere fraction of a physician training, prescribe meds, should we have a problem with a pharmacist prescribing a 5-day course of an antiviral? This logic is inconsistent. And inconsistent logic really, really bothers me. I actually think pharmacists should have prescribing privileges for a host of medicines. Take statin drugs, for instance. Many of my colleagues bemoan the underuse of these drugs. All right then, don't you think statin prescriptions would increase if we let pharmacists prescribe them? Finally, would this not be a golden opportunity to study different care models with cluster randomized trials? Randomize parts of a hospital system or part of a city and study patient satisfaction and outcomes or safety. Okay, final topic today is statins and guidelines. JAMA Cardiology has published a provocative study from Danish authors comparing, quote, statin eligibility for primary prevention in the newest ESC guidelines. And this is complicated, and I will try to explain, I think, unnecessarily complicated. Here's the short story as I understand it. ESC guides statin use based on the notion of matching the intensity of treatment with absolute risk. Now, this I have come to feel might be a dubious principle, but let's accept it for now. I'll come back to it. To wit, if statins reduce risk by 25%, then 25% of a higher absolute risk is a bigger number than 25% reduction of a smaller absolute risk. Now, in the past, ESC used a risk score that included only cardiovascular death. It was called Score 1. Now, if you believe that MI and stroke are important outcomes to prevent, such a score will underestimate risk. So they came up with a new score called Score 2, which gets closer to our pooled cohort equation or the UK NICE Q-risk formulas for estimating absolute risk. Now, one other important thing about Score 2 is that it's geography specific. Western European countries such as Denmark and Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, UK, etc. are considered low risk by the World Health Organization because they have low CV death rates. So there is a low risk Score 2 score. I told you this was complicated. The question that the authors of this paper had is, how does the new risk score perform relative to the ACC and UK scores? And they used the low-risk version of the Score 2 estimator. The main outcome measures were calibration of risk calculator, sensitivity, specificity, and, most importantly, statin eligibility under this new guideline. Now, the way they did this is they take a large cohort study from Denmark, about 66,000 people who were free of heart disease, diabetes, and CKD, and they were not on statins. The follow-up was nearly a decade. Now, this is possible in Denmark because of their excellent health database. Of course, we can't do such a thing here. And the findings. The Score 2 score correlated well with other models. Score 2 showed the best goodness of fit while having similar discriminatory performance as the other models. But Score 2 dramatically reduced Class 1 recommendations for statin use compared with the pooled cohort equation and UK scores. The updated age-specific recommendations dramatically reduced the eligibility of statins to only 4% with low sensitivity for detecting future cardiac events. Notably, less than 1% of women met the new 2021 ESC treatment criteria. So the old ESC guidelines and the ACC and UK guidelines provided Class 1 indications for about 20 to 34% of individuals. Authors provided a table in the paper in which they can dial in whichever percentage eligible you'd like by simply changing the threshold risk for statin use in the new Score 2 system. And the editorialists agree with the tone of the authors that the new ESC guidelines for primary prevention is not good. Not good because so many fewer patients would have class 1 indications for statins. Now, their most compelling point comes in the problem with using geography to influence risk. For instance, Denmark has very low cardiovascular death rates and high statin use. And they argue that the high statin use is one of the causal factors in producing this low cardiovascular event rate. Though, having been recently in Denmark, I suspect that their low cardiovascular risk has a lot more to do with their culture, say the notion of janteloven, and the fact that they ride their bikes places instead of using SUVs. Well, my comments. I think all of this is at least partially wrong-headed. First of all, statin thresholds ought to be in the eye of the beholder, not doctors. We use anticoagulation, and they have to reduce a 2.2% annual risk to about 1%. That's a tiny reduction in absolute terms. And anticoagulations are higher risk than statins. So who's to say there is some magic 10-year risk that warrants statins or doesn't warrant statins? People feel differently about this. Some people would like to minimize cardiac risk to the lowest level possible, and they don't mind taking a daily tablet. Others hate tablets and worry far more about cancer than heart attack. And cardiologists, I think, often forget that there are many, many worse causes of death than heart disease. And I know this because I am married to a palliative care physician who can tell stories that make heart disease look mild. The point is that statins ought to be a personal decision, and guideline thresholds are dumb. 25% relative risk reduction applies to everyone. Now, the other thing I really wonder about, and I really would appreciate your feedback, is that we might be wrong about this whole absolute risk thing. Now, what if Brian Ferentz and the Mendelian randomization colleagues are right, and the key to maximizing benefit is the duration of exposure to low LDL levels? Now, this would argue for much earlier exposure to statins, regardless of a risk calculator. Now, I know there are unknown unknowns about statins because the trials are short in duration, and cardiovascular prevention is measured in decades. But I'll close with a comment that the point of preventive therapies is to become old and higher risk. The potential gain from preventive therapies may actually be greater when used at younger ages and in those with lower risk for longer durations. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. Remember, if you like this podcast, please take the time to give it a rating. Writing us a little 1-sentence, 2-sentence review on whatever podcast app you use goes a long way to helping others discover us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.